Welcome to the Atheists for Liberty editorial board podcast. My name is Peter Clarke, and today I am joined by Sarah Myers, who is a writer covering topics related to psychology, human rights, and culture. She writes for Psychology Today and Free Inquiry magazine. Sarah has a master's degree in behavioral neuroscience and is currently pursuing an MFA in creative nonfiction at the New School in New York City. Sarah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I primarily want to talk about this article that you wrote for Free Inquiry magazine titled God, Mental Health, and the Millennial Mind. It's a pretty sprawling article. There's a lot there, and almost every paragraph from that article, like questions were jumping into my mind, like, oh, this would be so much fun to talk about. And the thesis of the article ends up kind of, really kind of focusing on the meaning and the purpose of life as an atheist. To broadly summarize it. But before we get to there, let me walk down a couple of questions for you that will maybe lead us into that broader discussion. First of all, the article starts out talking a lot about how a lot of young people today just grow up atheist as kind of a default setting, and they don't even think much about it. And they think that maybe even thinking about atheism too much, in even maybe obsessing over Richard Dawkins or something, is just weird and maybe cringe, because it just seems obvious that we live in a world where there's no God. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I lived through exactly that. So I'm 30 years old, so I'm a younger millennial, maybe 3 or 4 years on the tail end of the generation. So I feel like by the time that I was growing up, people were so familiar with atheism that it wasn't even a worthy point of discussion. And the way we treat it, I mean, I grew up in the Bible Belt in St. Louis, Missouri. And even though we were surrounded by religion, I somehow found all the people and kids that were more atheists and grew up in secular families. Or if they grew up in religious families, they ended up abandoning the religion, but it wasn't really a huge deal to them. And the way we owned atheism was actually not by owning it and just basically rejecting the idea of God, and then we didn't go further than that.
What about all the kids you grew up around who were Christian? Because I grew up Christian, and to me, I did very much feel this culture battle that was happening, and I always felt on the defensive, because I think I did kind of naturally feel that there was just this push to be an atheist, it was cool to be an atheist or something like that.
Yeah.
How did you relate to people who were Christian, and do you think that they felt at all threatened by maybe you and your beliefs if you didn't have a God belief? Or
I think that definitely was the case. So when I was growing up, there was definitely a lot of people and kids when I was in high school who wanted to bring me to church. I had very many Catholic and Christian friends who I even went to church with since I was a kid. But I don't know, I think because I had a home environment and a group of friends that were always kind of atheists and secular, I didn't really feel like I was being converted in the true sense, in that I was in a way humoring them by going, and more kind of just taking the religion as more of an intellectual interest than I was actually devoting myself to it. And I know I talk in the article that I ended up having my first episode of psychosis, and that's when I got religious experiences, is what I call them. But since I didn't have the vocabulary to attribute them to anything else, religion was the next best thing to explore those experiences with. So really the religion, it was just basically an outlet to explore the irrational.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned in the article that when you went through some, I think you called it psychosis. I'm not sure exactly what the term would be, but you said that at some point you thought that you were Jesus. And this is actually one of my favorite topics to go into online, because there's a Wikipedia article of all the people who claim to be Jesus throughout history, and it's a long article. And if you click on any one of these names that has a link, it's all fascinating. It's all pretty interesting. Having kind of experienced that yourself, what is your perspective on let's say just that Wikipedia article with all these people claiming to be Jesus, do you think that there's a lot of mental health issues happening there? And I mean, do you think that that even extrapolates to Jesus, the historical figure himself?
Yeah, I mean, delusions are kind of complicated, but I don't think they're as complicated as people want to make them out to be. I think that delusions in general have a kernel of truth to them, and it depends on where that stems from individual to individual. But I think that if you are experiencing delusions and thinking that you are someone who you really aren't, that's a delusion. And I think there's definitely a lot of mental health issues packed behind that statement that I am Jesus. For me, I thought it was interesting because when I told my philosophy professor that I thought I was Jesus when I was in psychosis, but when I wasn't in psychosis, I basically reverted to my default stance was that I wasn't really thinking about it, but I knew that I didn't have a relation to religion or Christianity. So I think that when people say they're Jesus, definitely um, they definitely have gone off the deep end, and that list is really funny because I think that that list indicates the people who have gone to great lengths to actually organize an entire movement behind their delusional belief.
Yeah.
And I think that's very different from what I experience and what people with schizophrenia experience, because I think people with mental illness do not have the ability to organize mass movements, whereas these people do.
This is possibly a side topic, but by any chance, are you familiar with Julian Jaynes and his theory of the bicameral mind?
Yes, yeah, I have that book on my bookshelf.
Let me see if I can articulate this for anyone watching, and maybe I want to get your thoughts if you think that there's any legitimacy to it. So Julian Jaynes was I believe, a psychology professor at Yale in the 70s or something like this, and he wrote this book called The Bicameral Mind, and it hypothesized that back in the day, people didn't have any sense of like free will or consciousness like we do today. And if you read old books, like the Old Testament and like the Iliad, there is no sense of an internal self that people have. Whenever someone takes an action, it's just God spoke to me and I did this. So if you read the Iliad, it is all that. It is God spoke to me and I did this. And so the theory is that over time, as language developed a little bit further, and as we, for example, be able gain the ability to speak in allegories and metaphors, all of a sudden we started losing that voice in our head, and it just wasn't so pronounced until all of a sudden it kind of went away, and then all of a sudden we were able to take action based on thinking, like real, like normal thoughts or whatever that people have, not like the voice of God in my head. And I mean, he does, I think, have a fairly convincing rationale for this hypothesis, but it's he hasn't proved it or anything like this, but it's an explanation for why maybe schizophrenia still exists, why people do still hear voices. It's a remnant of this old thing before we had the modern version of the consciousness, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. So I think when I remember reading that, I actually resonate a lot with it. And I actually wrote an article recently about the Ipsity disturbance model of schizophrenia, which basically says the same thing, where people in psychosis have a lack of stable self. And that's the entire theory that grounds the work of psychosis today, even in research. So a lot of what Julian Jaynes was talking about in that book, how I think that when people were working on the fields or like in the hot sun, they started hallucinating or thinking that God was talking to them. A lot of his ideas ring true in that the first episode of Psychosis ends up being started because of a stressful period in a person's life. And the sense of self destabilization that comes with that is thinking that other things are not happening to you when they really are. So I would say that the voices and thoughts that I hear in my head are not actually mine and they're hallucinations, or maybe I'm tying my shoe and I don't think that I'm actually tying my shoe. It's somebody else commanding me to do it. I think that appeared a lot historically because people were living in a huge time of stress. I mean, civilization wasn't really formed and we didn't have our basic needs met. So it would make sense that a lot of people were experiencing these not fully collected states of mind. And there is a lot of research that confirms that now in terms of schizophrenia. I don't know what else. I don't know if anybody's actually taken his theories and actually applied it directly to studies now. I'd have to do more research on that.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into that just because it is one of these things that I feel like, I don't know, I want to actually talk to an expert on that. But for anyone watching, if you are curious about alternative explanations for why religion exists in the first place, this is one of them. So Julian Jaynes' bicameral mind theory, it is a treasure trove. It's just fascinating things. It also, gives you a perspective on ancient literature. That's really
I
interesting.
actually I actually think I was thinking about that when I was writing the article, because when
Oh,
I'm trying to say that millennials are turning to astrology and all of these new age explanations for why things are the way they are, I think that in the article I talk about some research that shows that millennials are just a very stressed out generation. And I think that the blend of growing up secular but also not having a organized religion has led people to adapt some of these fringe or like kind of more new agey things that kind of relate to life as it is now, but don't really have that traditional historical context, because I think that people who are exploring spirituality now didn't grow up with that. I don't know if that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, it doesn't. And what is your sense of people, very, very young kids today, maybe kids who are in their teens? What is your sense of their trajectory, whether or not they're going to embrace religion at all? Do you have any sense of if they're going to have the same kind of default view that you grew up with, that, of course, like everyone's atheist, or it's not even like worth fighting about necessarily? Do you think that that's still kind of resonant with young people?
I don't think that. I actually think that it's going to be the opposite, where people are going to embrace religion, but they're going to do it in a way that's not in any way related to the traditional form. So I think that young people are like, there's this huge interest in like Islam and Christianity and new forms that don't have anything related to the traditional church and its like orthodoxy in the way it handles LGBT issues or any type of like oppression that would feel really weird considering today's modern progressive advancements. And I just I think that there will be people who reject atheism and secularism, but I think that it, yeah, weirdly, I think that people will actually go back to some kind of spirituality because they would be looking for something that would fill the void, which I think the atheist movement hasn't done yet.
Yeah, okay. So that's a good segue to talking about higher purpose, which was a big section of your article. Let me just kind of ask, or maybe I'll lead with this. In the article, you talked about how at one point you were talking to a therapist and they were going down this road a little bit of kind of like a spiritual thing, or maybe you should pray, I think that they said, and you said, but I'm an atheist. Walk me through what the therapist said next and how that resonated with you.
They basically said that's okay. Everybody has a sense of higher power. Atheists, believe in their connection to nature and the universe. Um, and I actually took that with a grain of salt because I didn't believe that. I think that atheists kind of do many things to replace their lack of faith. And some of us believe in the power of nature, some of us believe in science to understand nature. As far as do I think people have a sense of higher power, I don't think that's true. So when she asked me that, I basically tried to do a thought experiment and be like, well, if I did have a higher power, what would that feel like? And what would that be? And I had a hard time actually forming that. Um, and I don't think I've ever really gotten to a place where I feel like I can pray or worship to something, even though I do those activities. I don't like have one thing that I pray to. It's more like when I get desperate, I want to pray to something to save me, and I will start switching between uh like past lives or nature, the science, or the things I hallucinate, like what I would call angels or voices, and all of those I don't really commit to believing in, but I do think that they serve a purpose in the times that I'm stressed out.
Okay, yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. I personally kind of take issue with the idea of the higher power. I think that there are maybe
Yeah.
just better ways to phrase that same thing, like a sense of awe and wonder. I
Hmm.
totally connect with that. I also totally connect with the idea of stories being really powerful. And I think a lot of people who get comfort from religion, it's just a comforting story. Like just the idea when you die, you go to heaven.
Hmm.
That's a nice story, like sometimes maybe you need that or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really nice story, but like if you're growing up secular and atheist, you can't commit to it because
Yeah.
it's not community based and it's not tied to your whole, I don't know, who you are as an identity. So when people say higher power or something, I feel like I'm just making shit up. Like I just like I just like feel like I'm bullshitting myself because it just doesn't make any sense to me. Like I said, when people say religious experiences, I had no idea what that means, even though, and I would never like label my experience as that. And it's just like a whole new world of vocabulary that I think people haven't formed yet.
Right. So, but you have written that there maybe is some benefit to prayer. And if, I mean, like studies have kind of shown that like brain makes you, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but
Hmm.
like it's psychologically healthy at some level. And also you write about how like the Sam Harris method of meditation also super beneficial and kind of sort of for either prayer or meditation or mindfulness. I don't think you have to actually buy into there being some God in the traditional sense, right? I mean, you can still say that it's just neurons in my brain, but for whatever reason I'm doing an activity that makes me feel better, and this activity seems to just kind of sort of mirror a religious activity or something. Or what are your
Yeah,
thoughts
I
there?
mean, like, like people enter different states of consciousness all the time. I did an article series with a psychologist in St. Louis about this for my blog at Psychology Today. So you can enter a different state of mind without actually committing to the beliefs that you have in the moment. So if you do like drugs like ayahuasca or like a psychedelic or something, and you happen to think that you are talking to Jesus or you're talking to these gnomes or something that people often hallucinate, it doesn't mean that you'll carry that belief outside of the experience. So, like I said, I sometimes pray when I'm feeling like I need it. Not that I think that there's a continuous belief system I have around what I'm praying to or what it really means in my life, but I think that this is the type of spirituality that I think people are starting to dabble in. I think they go a step further and say it's like astrology or new age beliefs or something, but I refuse to adopt that terminology because I think that that would bring a whole like framework into it that wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, me too. The frameworks I think get very just cringy, if nothing else. Just like the
Yeah.
Christian framework at some level is cringy. But I remember listening to the podcast How Stuff Works, and they had an episode on tarot cards. Kind of a fun podcast. They go into like do deep dives on like everything. It's fun. But they had one on tarot cards, and it actually kind of for the first time ever, I was like, oh, maybe that's not the dumbest thing on the entire planet, because they talked about how like I think this is true. Like originally it wasn't like super woo like it is nowadays. Originally it was just kind of like telling a story. And when you tell a story, you're just articulating you're making sense of your life in a different context or something
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm.
But I mean, I do think that maybe the problem there is that if you do tarot readings all the time or palm readings or any of the other new age stuff, which I'm not even sure if it's still a thing, but like I definitely know people who are into it. I mean, I live in California; it's totally a thing out here.
Oh yeah.
I think that like you can walk yourself into just becoming a non-rational person at some point, where all of a sudden you're determining what to wear today or how to vote based on the signs in the sky or whatever. I mean, famously, was it Reagan's wife? I think that she used to uh, like help Reagan decide foreign policy based on astrology or something like that. Like there's some story about that. So I mean, like I worry about dabbling in any of that just because there's a little bit of a slippery slope thing possibly that can happen. Maybe
Yeah.
I don't know. But what are your thoughts on like dabbling in
I
and
totally
do that.
understand the concern, and I think there's a difference between I think that's not dabbling anymore. Like when you're using, I don't know, you just said tarot to determine foreign policy, that's definitely not dabbling anymore. And I think that's taking it a step further. What I'm talking about, like, is exploring the irrational state of humanity, which is like so foundational to how we operate because we are like not the prefrontal cortex that we're talking about that didn't develop until recently. So the majority of our history as like creatures of the earth has been irrational and circular and really nonsensical. And I think that when atheists don't accept that there's a huge component to that and that most people act like that, not to say that everybody's acting like an ancient like Homo sapien, I don't even know, like like reverting back to like a bad place where they're so irrational that they're non-functioning in like normal society, but um exploring it, like the feelings that you have, because I think does a go along. Okay, sorry, I'm messing up, but I think that irrationality happens before you crystallize any belief in due to reason. So when you have a reasonable thought or a reasonable belief system and you've thought out the ideology like maybe atheists have, um you've basically gone through a logical challenge of your irrationality. And I think this can also be true for people who are new Christians,
Mm.
but they, I think, have retained like very elemental aspects of living, like love. I think people say that Christianity's God is basically love. And these irreducible feelings of love or wonder or things that just don't make any sense other than the fact that they exist and we can't get rid of them in our worldviews.
You write pretty directly towards the end of this article that you think that the atheist movement needs to evolve. Tell me a little
Yeah.
bit about that.
I think that it's related to what I just said. So I think that if you don't have spirituality, you can still have depth um, for life. I mean, I call myself an artist and a deep feeler and thinker. And part of what sustains me is having those deep feelings that maybe result in religious experiences. So I try to balance the rational challenge of questioning my delusions and hallucinations and my deep feelings, while also having some kind of sacredness to what I feel. um, I don't know if this is making any sense. But I don't know if you read my article about my dog that passed away last year.
I read some of
Uh,
it, yeah.
yeah, so basically just having that, I don't know if you want to call it spiritual. It's just like a sense of care and knowing that you're a fragile person in on earth. Like just recognizing your vulnerability, I think, helps with this process. And I think that atheists don't have a humility when it comes to interacting with the world, and the way that atheists has portrayed itself in culture, like with through the atheist conventions or stuff, has been very arrogant and
Yeah.
directed at other people who are in religion instead of making the focus on the relationship between the self and the universe. And that involves more humility and vulnerability than it does challenging or being more confident against another person's irrational argument.
So someone comes up to you and they're, let's say, religious, and they say point blank, what's your meaning and purpose in life? How do you have a meaning or purpose if you don't believe in God?
I mean, my immediate response was that, well, I believe in love and I believe in our connection between us two. I don't have to believe in your same God. And usually, um, and it's kind of funny because I've been dating a lot of Muslims. And I feel close to them in ways that I have never gotten from other people of different other religions. And one person said, like, atheism, religion, or Judaism, Islam, Christianity, it's all the same. And I think that what he was trying to get at was that we all feel like if you have a faith, then the faith, if it's healthy, should be grounded in love. Or, I don't know, I'm going in circles, but I think that sort of makes sense to me.
So I do want to talk about Ayaan Hirsi Ali directly. This conversation does at this moment in time, it kind of dances around her deconversion from atheism, if you want to call it that, or I guess it would just be conversion to Christianity. And she had this conversation with Richard Dawkins recently on dissident dialogues. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, I could probably talk forever about that conversation, why I thought that Richard didn't necessarily always do a great job in his responses, etc. But I mean, fundamentally, Ayaan started saying that, or at least the impression that she initially gave, I thought, was that Christianity was a useful tool to like fight wokeness. And it was a useful tool to provide her meaning when she was really struggling. She went through a very hard time and she needed this connection that she didn't find in the material world. And she just had the language of Christianity there. So she adopted it. And then when she was confronted by Richard about this, she did kind of double down about, oh no, like I do believe this. I do believe these things. He tried to nail her to the wall about like Jesus rising from the dead in 3 days. Do you believe that? She had this really interesting phrase, I choose to believe it. That to me was so interesting. It's kind of so telling. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that situation?
I definitely recognize this process. I think that I even went through a similar process. I think when you're so desperate for getting out of a desperate and horrible mental state, you choose to adopt beliefs in order to get the greater reward, which is the benefits of believing in God. Because when you adopt that belief, then everything becomes so much easier. So I think that there are many steps to getting that benefit, and that's partly through the church and through baptism or through prayer or through going to service. And I think that when she says I choose to believe in it, she's kind of forgiving all of those things, because I think to her they're not as meaningful than what an atheist like Richard Dawkins would say. He would say that, do you actually believe that Jesus was the savior? He came down to earth and rose after 3 days, or I don't even know the detail, but those details are very important to him, but they're not important to her because that's not the big picture of her religion, I guess.
Seems to me that you totally can choose to believe anything, particularly if you find it useful. But again, that can just like lead you down a weird path. Like I can choose to believe I'm the world's best opera singer. I can totally choose to believe that, but that doesn't mean I am. And then I don't know, like what good is that if I believe something? I mean, at some level that's absurd, but it's good to believe in yourself that you're going to succeed, even if maybe you're not. I don't know, but the further you get on that road of choosing to believe something, just the weirder it gets, right?
I think that when she says that, it's also about a form of doing the opposite. So when you're saying, I choose to believe I'm the greatest opera singer in the world, that's a form of, you're giving up, in a way, I think you're giving up control, because you're entering an irrational world that makes no sense. Well, sorry, no offense. Maybe you are a great opera singer, but
never know.
I hope this makes sense. But so I think that when she's coming from is this place of mental despair, and like she completely fell apart, and she explicitly stated that in the debate and in the talk. And from her vantage point, she was out of control. Like her mind basically took her over. And when you choose to adopt like a structure of spirituality that kind of self-organizes those mental states, I think it becomes easier to say you choose that structure over the lack of structure that is inherent in mental illness.
That makes sense. Yeah, that totally makes sense because there is structure there, and that structure is a story that has built into it like all the profundities that you need for a good story. It's got all the Hollywood stuff in there. And I would say that at some level it doesn't make sense, the idea of like God killing himself to forgive you. Why not just forgive you? Why put that messy structure there in the first place where God has to allegedly come down as a human and kill himself? Like that story is beautiful until you think about it for like 2 seconds, where it's like the only reason that story was written down in the Bronze Age was because back then all the cultures of the world thought you literally had to kill an animal to make it so that it will rain tomorrow. It's that story structure, and for some reason the modern mind tolerates that only and literally only in one place, and that's the Jesus story. And no other aspect is that story structure given even like 2 seconds of credence, like ever at all. But yeah, I guess Christians, they owned it. They put enough flowery language and poetry around it to make it so that people still resonate with it, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you don't have any other explanations for why things are the way they are, the biblical stories are the most reliable in terms of institutional structure, and so many
Yes.
people are going to put money and effort into preserving that, and it's like kind of the best system we have for solving some of your greatest mental woes. Like, I don't know, like, and it's like, at least like when I work in psychology, there's no theory or any satisfactory answer that will explain why you suffer. So if there's a way to bring you out of that suffering, I think that if religion is it, I think that makes sense for them to adopt it, because that's how they would choose to accept all these like maybe irrational things, but it brings them better clarity and better way to live.
Right, right. Yeah, I actually have one more thought about the choosing to believe topic that just came to mind, which was that Curtis Yarvin, of all people, had this perspective the other day, or actually maybe it was a while ago, but he had this perspective that, why are people still religious today? He said that, why do people believe in God? It's like, well, why do people believe in Hamlet? People believe in Hamlet. Like I believe in Hamlet. Hamlet was a fictional character, but you believe in him because you're able to make greater sense of reality by believing in him, and the world itself is richer because of that belief that you believe in Hamlet. Or Don Quixote is a character that my mind very often contemplates. It's just like, oh, that's a very uh, quixotic or whatever the word is scenario, right? And it's kind of the same thing with God. I think that you believe in God in the sense that you believe in Don Quixote or Hamlet, or name your fictional character, and there is actually something there, right? Like believing in a fictional character, I guess in modernity would be Batman or Superman or something. When you believe in that, you are able to put yourself and your life and your circumstances in reference to that character and then go forward. I mean, if there's one thing that is not bullshit in the world, it's the three-act structure of a story where you have your inciting incident, your character goes through a lot of shit, and then they come out on the other side of it a champion, and everyone resonates with that so hard. So there's something there. I just don't. Yeah, I mean, maybe that is what Ion is accepting, and I don't know. Yeah.
I think, yeah, like, I mean, if you look at theology, like theologians and their interpretations of biblical stories, it's very more symbolic than it is literal,
Yeah.
which I think is what pop culture or pop culture atheists tend to view Bible stories as. And the process of like Jesus, like I mean, I'm not familiar with the whole story, but embodying the, I don't even know enough of the story to even talk about it, but I just remember that I just remember that there's like various forms of Christianity that you can have, and one of them being Christian atheism, which denies the existence of a physical power and higher being, but instead the the sense of God is more about the act of submission to the power that the universe has on you. And I think that some of the Bible stories kind of talk about that. Maybe like Jesus died for your sins. And so there's a lot of passion and sacrifice that I think that people naturally feel in life that is kind of unavoidable to the average person. And I think that if you have a story, like you said, that's really descriptive and symbolic of that process, and you feel like you're understood and I don't know, you'll accept anything that goes with it, because the ultimate result is that it provides better livelihood for you than a lack of faith.
Right. Yeah, that's all very interesting. I have one more thought that I want to run past you. Actually, just today, I just finished this book, The Status Game by Will Storr. It has this terrible cover, but I just finished this just today, actually. And the very, very, very last line I want to read to you and run by you. Are you familiar with this book, this author, by any chance?
No.
He's talked to Sam Harris. He was on Joe Rogan. He had when this book came out, he was like everywhere. He was like one of these guys that just did the podcast circuit, and I was compelled to buy his book, and I definitely don't regret it. It's one of these things where the book is still better than not only the movie but also the podcast interview.
Oh, there's a movie. Wow. Okay.
Oh well, I just meant that kind of flippantly in terms of we always say that the book is better than the movie.
Okay.
Well, the book is better than the podcast interview too. It turns out. So this book is all about how everything that we do in life is kind of a status game. Kind of fundamentally, who we marry, what job we take, what hobbies we have, how we dress, all down the line. And of course, there's a chapter about religion and why religion began and still exists as a status game. Especially the most successful ones anyway, are very successful status games. But he closes his book out with this quote. It ends up talking quite a bit about like how to lead a good life and how to have meaning and purpose in life through your status games that you're going to play, that we're all going to play. And this is the very last line in the book. Nobody wins the status game. They're not supposed to. The meaning of life is not to win, it's to play. And my question to you, maybe to make a very clear question, is in religion, it's clear how to play the status game. Whereas, I mean, it's a pious game. That is what religion is. It's a pious game and a virtue game. In secular society, for the contemporary atheist, it's not necessarily so clear which game or games to play. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on this concept of this, looking at human purpose as a status game and seeking status for a sense of fulfillment. Does that resonate with you at all? And if so, what do you think an atheist should do to perform status games that replace religious status games?
Well, does it need to be a status game? Is my first question, because in a way I'm like, why does some guy saying that everything is a status game have to be?
Let me make it semi-personal. When we right before we hit record, you said that you've always wanted to be a writer in New York, and so you moved to New York and you're a writer. There's only one reason to do that, right? One, it's fun and it's awesome and it's cool, but that's a status game, right? So your life is organized around a sense of status. I always wanted to move to California, and because everyone cool is in California when I was young, so okay, gonna move to California. Total status game. My life itself is kind of revolving around that. So I don't know. That maybe puts some context to it.
I guess okay. Thanks for reverting it back to me. That makes sense. So I guess for me, I put my life into my career, and I think that also ties into the feminist era that I live in and girl boss mentality. So I think that I'm driven by a lot of Western media about what I was fed growing up, which is go to New York, be a big city independent woman and make your own ideas and intellectual theories, and that I guess is very status seeking. Do I think that atheists should do that? Is that what you're asking? Or we should find a status game that is going to make us be better people? Because I don't think this makes me a better person at all.
Oh, yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. So maybe now that I'm thinking about it slightly more, is that religion as a status game was all about a virtue game. And so maybe this is Ayaan Hirsi Ali's problem with the modern atheist, is that they seek their status games through just virtue signaling, and it's the Twitter warrior, right, who just like they feel so like virtuous for just like tweeting like this is the
Okay.
correct view on the Israel-Palestine war or whatever. And that like literally, I think I'm going to say this strongly. That literally is what atheists have replaced virtue games with, is just the Twitter warrior or maybe the campus protester. And these kind of like vapid things that like this was said all the time when like campuses were exploding with protests, that all these kids are just trying to signal that they're on the right side of history. Like cynical commentators all over said that as a diagnosis. Do you think that there's anything more worthwhile that atheists can do to achieve a sense of virtue in the world?
Short answer, yes. And I think that you're really right about that. I think that's what I complain about most with the atheist world, is that we have turned everything into a Twitter war or Twitterverse, whatever, like it basically wrestling match. I don't even know. But I think that, okay, I'm not going to put myself on a pedestal, but I'm trying to describe my motivations for my status competition. Like when I think about, being a writer or moving to New York or traveling a lot to other countries, I'm thinking about how I'm advancing myself as a woman and my context as a woman in the world, and what I'm doing to benefit the community and the field of literary writing and who I am as a person. And I think that atheists, engaging in Twitter wars, is that really helping people who are atheists? Like, does that really advance who we represent as people? I don't think it does. And I think that even in older magazines, though, like Free Inquiry, they also are victim to this idea that we should still be bashing people who are religious because that's the only fight that we need to win. When maybe a better fight would be mastery of the self and how we can advance our own uh, accomplishments through what we can do as individuals. And
Yeah, and maybe I am kind of seeing that secular people are starting to reaffirm the value of the family in a way that I don't think that they were 10 years ago. There used to be a big, at least, in my circles, like, you don't need to have kids, you don't need a family. I'm super independent and I party every night, and this is the only way to live once you kind of like made it as a coastal elite or whatever the term would be. I think that that's changing. I think that all of a sudden, especially as a lot of mainstream figures, I'm blanking on a better one, so I'll just say Elon Musk, who has like 10 kids or whatever. But like a lot of people are in that world right now, where all of a sudden it's kind of cool to be seen as a good dad or whatever. Where I don't know if it was previously. So that's a shift that I'm maybe seeing a little bit.
I think that has to do with like the backlash of the left. So like I think that in rejecting far leftism, and people are honestly moving more right, which I'm one of those people. I'm basically center right at this point, and I do hold those values where preserving the nuclear family and like traditional notions that you would only think would exist in religious cultures. But I think that we're like seeing maybe the chaos of what it could be as a radical on one end, and then you're trying to go towards the other end as a backlash and rebellious move, I think. So it's like kind of ricocheting off each other. But I think that, like once there's the initial shock value that the new atheist movement brought, and then it shook everything up, and then there were people who were like totally into that, and then now it like, I mean, half of the atheists are now saying that like far left politics kind of shook everything up in their gender pronouns or something, or like just doing a lot of like far left stuff that they didn't agree with, that were basically chaos to them. And so trying to maintain that sense of stability and traditional like practice kind of helps create again a structure that sticks. So yeah, like I guess like when you're progressive, you're always trying to like shake things up and like change things how they are, but like conservatism will like maintain the. And I think that also like we're getting older, so secularists who were active in the movement like 10 years ago. So we're probably all old enough to like have kids and start a family now. And I think that, I mean, it's always known that people who, when they get older, they become more conservative.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that a little bit. I like how you use the word traditional there. That was a word that I think that I was reaching for at one point. And there is this traditional versus progressive tension very, very deeply. And I don't think that atheists naturally fall on either side of that, but maybe younger generations felt compelled to lean towards a progressive thing just because atheism kind of comes out of a rebellious place of being anti-Christian, and Christian in America is very conservative. So maybe it just kind of made sense that 10 years ago, when people were very into Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they would gravitate towards a progressive view. Whereas now, maybe when we're further past that, again, kind of like I was thinking there, I don't think atheism naturally sways either way towards traditionalism or progressivism once you kind of take yourself out of the paradigm of I live in a Christian culture sort of thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think, well, it's funny though that you say that, because if the atheists who were listening to Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins back then, people are saying that Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are actually right wing. So
true, yeah, that's kind of silly.
So it's just funny. But yeah, I think that, yeah, it's just a mix of like people getting older, and like when you have a cultural shock, like maybe Obama and then the Trump thing, like
Yeah.
you'll have society swing from one extreme to the other. And I think that's maybe what could be happening now with the atheist movement.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, there is so much there. Unfortunately, I need to wrap it up, but let me know, Sarah, what are you up to next? Are you working on any other articles or projects?
I am. So I'm writing a memoir about schizoaffective disorder and what that was like, how I experienced
Cool.
that during the 2016 election, as well as all the current events that kind of unraveled after that. And yeah, I'm just continuing to write for Psychology Today, and I'll be coming out with some essays, creative nonfiction essays soon.
Okay, great. I'll be on the lookout for those. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Nice conversation.